right, it is time for the event. And again, today we are celebrating On the Same Page. If you're not familiar with what On the Same Page is, it's a bi-monthly read, and we've been doing it for a very long time. So it's a bi-monthly read where we encourage all of San Francisco to read the same book. And I came across Elaine's book because it was a runner-up for a 2019 One City, One Book, which Tommy Orange was the recipient of that. So ever since I read her book, we need to get this back. We need to place this in and celebrate America's Not the Heart. It's a very beautiful book, amazing characters, strong female characters, and so accessible to, there's criteria for One City, One Book, which is accessible to high schoolers and above. And it just really is that. So America's Not the Heart was named one of the best books of 2018 by NPR, LitHub, the Boston Globe, SF Chronicles, the New York Post, Kirkus Reviews, and New York Public Library. Elaine Castillo was born in San Francisco Bay Area. She graduated from the University of Berkeley, California. Ismail Muhammad is a writer and critic based in Oakland. He's the criticism editor for The Believer and a contributing editor at Zizaba and a contributing writer at The Nation. He also got his PhD in English from UC Berkeley. His work focuses on literature, art, identity, and Black popular and visual culture. So let's do it and turn it over to Ismail Muhammad and Elaine Castillo. And Elaine, thank you for sharing your book with us.
Oh, Anissa, thank you so much. Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you to you and Lisa for setting this up and doing all of the technical magic that makes all of this possible. It's a real honor to be here, to be the On the Same Page author. It would be an honor at any year with this library at any time, but particularly in this hell year to cap it off it's a personal sort of spark of joy in what has otherwise been a pretty hellish year. So I'm very grateful to be here, and obviously incredibly, incredibly grateful to be in conversation with my friend, favorite critic, Ismail. He paid me to say this, Ismail Muhammad. I would be happy to have.
I sent you.
Just you Venmo me the check later. Who I'd be happy and honored to be in conversation with anywhere at any donut shop, but even more so to get to do it here. So I'm really looking forward to tonight. So thank you.
Yeah, I feel like obviously I want to talk to you about the stuff we'll be discussing at any time, but I'm honored to do this. For the SFPL, and thank the organizers for having us tonight. I will try to be as professional as I can.
We will try to be and try not to pretend like we're just somewhere shooting shit.
Exactly.
I've already cursed, so it's all downhill from here.
And we will get to the novel, but I think by way of getting there, Elaine and I want to discuss some of the things we've been thinking about and discussing over the last month or so. We've been in conversation a lot lately. So we'll be talking broadly about like our literary culture, and then find our way to the book. And the first thing I want to ask you about is that recent New York Times article titled "Why is Publishing So White?" It's by Richard So and Gus Wezarek, who I believe are both professors at the University of Chicago. And they used data to get to a point that shocked me, honestly, being as jaded as I am. It even shocked me. That's something like only 5% of literary fiction novels published since 1950 were published by POC writers.
Probably 4% of that was because of Toni Morrison at Random House.
Exactly right. Exactly. And so I wonder, like, what surprises us about that information, and what are we not surprised by, just by virtue of obviously being fiction writers, critics, just being POC people in the publishing industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think we, especially this year, we've had sort of a wave of this type of sort of article, sort of essentially agonizing over there's no really other way to put it, the kind of dementedly racist and structurally racist, institutionally racist publishing industry, and its absolute sort of failures on a representational sense, which is really, representational sense is probably in its own way the kind of least important sense, but even on that sort of base level, its failures. I think what's surprising, much like you, I think what surprised me is, despite how jaded I already am, there's ever more bottom to find. Like 5% is shocking. I think 5% by any metric is shocking. 5% since 1950 of that. And we weren't sure if this was literary fiction, if they were counting romance, if they were counting, genre fiction or YA. Of course, those of us who also know romance and genre fiction, like romance is not a bastion of diversity either. Romance has also had its huge controversies about race and the issues of race and how it affects romance publishing. So I don't actually have much faith that if the criteria was wider, that we would suddenly get this swath of some sort of representational utopia. I think so much of it, and this does seek into probably, if I do read a piece, I'm not sure, we can just have a conversation, but if I do read, I was thinking of reading from what I'm currently writing about, which is essays, or potentially just one long essay, but a collection of essays about our reading culture, because it is something that I have been thinking about since publishing in 2018 now, which, given the kind of time warp that 2020 was, it feels like a century away. It does feel like a different world. And the encounters that I had and the kind of realizations that I had about how writers of color were positioned within what we would call our sort of literary culture. And I'm speaking more specifically about American literary culture, but having done sort of international literary festivals also, I think it's applicable generally to our kind of Western literary culture, which at baseline felt, at the most basic level, that it positions POC writers as essentially repositories for ethnographic data, or as opportunities for people to learn about, third world countries, far-flung tragedy, disaster porn, with the end result being that what it felt to me that we had a reading culture that said we go to writers of color when we want to learn the specific, and we go to white writers when we want to feel the universal. And that differentiation and the way that it deformed our readership, how readers themselves were able to and also unable to really truly engage with the work of writers of color, felt very clear to me, but also how it deformed our writing, how it deformed writers' relationships to their own work, how to talk about their work, how to engage with the readers, when it felt so clear that within this atmosphere, writers of color in particular were essentially doing this secret second job, not being a writer, not even promoting being a writer, but also essentially managing white audiences in relation to the palatability of their work, or whether their work provided some kind of ethnographic frisson of excitement for a reader that was used to being catered to in that specific way. A book like American Dirt, that all of that, the fear around that is endemic of that, or emblematic of that.
If you think it's worthwhile getting to American Dirt, we can get to that.
Ismail and I were saying that we would like to bring haterism back to, maybe I shouldn't get into that.
Oh, there will be time to get to that. I think along the lines of what you were saying, I found myself really surprised as somebody who has in the past read for literary prizes and is an editor who gets books mailed to me all the time, at how few books by POC writers get published. And I'm thinking about this discrepancy between the faces that go up for awards at the end of every year, right, or at the beginning of every year, or the books that publishing house editors trumpet when they mail them out to review editors, and they're, I guess, like what I now know is the reality of what the industry does. And I'm wondering how do we think about that discrepancy between like the people whose faces are being trotted out there and the hard numbers?
Well, I mean, I think it's very much that phenomenon, that almost cliche, which is that, if you have the one who's won all the prizes, or the one who's the one successful Filipino American author or Filipinx American author, then that means that all Filipinx American authors and writers and artists have come over, have gotten over. And I think most of us know now, I mean, if we didn't already know, that is a smokescreen, that's obviously that's a diversionary tactic. You say that one you've singled out a sort of special person, and then that quota is filled, and then you can close the door after them, because you, as a sort of publishing entity or as a prize winning, as a kind of establishment entity, at that point, can soothe yourself with saying, well, we've done our duty. And so I think that discrepancy really shows how much of what we would call like the we need diverse books movement may also just be lip service ultimately, because if we're having just in terms of the maths, a scenario where it feels like certain writers of color are being sort of recognized and awarded, but the reality of the data is suggesting that writers of color, only 5% make up, the literary fiction that was published since 1950. Something there doesn't add up, and something smells like a lie.
Yeah. I mean, we want time to go into all of this, but I keep thinking about, we spoke about this, when we were talking last night, but the issue, and again, the article makes this point too, the issue is that the people at the tops of these organizations are white. And because they are white, they're going to be publishing certain kinds of things that are familiar to them. And until we have editors who are, BIPOC, who are queer, that doesn't seem like it's going to change very much. And so it comes down, as much as we want to think about like representation, it comes down to kind of like power in the end.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like we were saying, there's a materialist analysis behind everything, which is to say, I mean, but the whole, I mean, this is the thing I always say, that I very much believe in the we need diverse books movement, but I also think it will not be successful if we don't have we need diverse editors, we need diverse agents, we need diverse publishing houses, we need those mastheads to be diverse. I mean, my agent, I got my agent I met my agent when I was living in London. She's a Black British woman. In the run up to sort of meeting agents and sort of deciding on one, there were very few agents of color that I met. And having, now been her writer for, her name is Emma Patterson, by the way, and she's an amazing agent with incredible writers, and who's doing a lot of very important work to do exactly what we were saying, which is to make our literary culture actually reflect the world that it is supposedly writing to and for. I just think there were so many times where I would have walked into a room, and had not I been with her, I would have been the only person of color there. And rooms full of editors, or rooms full of marketing people or sales people. There are so many times where had we not been together, I would have been the only one. And two is not necessarily, is not a grand achievement, but it was meaningful. It made certain experiences, better.
With all that in mind, I do want to talk about these critical essays you've been working on. Do you want to read from one, and then we can come into?
Yeah, I can read a little bit from it. So I'm doing the thing. I was telling Anissa that I'm going to do a thing where I'm going to read something that hasn't been published yet, because I always kind of like that at readings, when if you've read the book, and that's fine, and I like hearing authors read from the books, but I also like getting a kind of like special secret preview. So that's basically what I'm doing. So I'm reading from a collection of essays that I've been working on that's about the politics of our reading culture, in particular about the racial politics of our reading culture, and what it just frankly and fundamentally needs to change about it. So this is from an essay called Reading Teaches Us Empathy and Other Fictions. And yeah, I'll just read a short bit from it. People often say that art builds our empathy. Reading in particular. It's one of those feel-good lines that gets trotted out often at literary readings, writing festivals, panel discussions on diversity in fiction, classrooms, book jackets, book reviews, book blurbs, not to mention uncomfortably long discussions with white people who read your book and want you to know for sure that they're not racist. The wisdom goes, we read books about immigration to make us more empathetic. We read books about queer people to make us more empathetic. We need diverse books because they make us more empathetic. But the idea that fiction builds empathy is one of incomplete politics, left hanging by probably good intentions. The concept of instrumentalizing fiction as a kind of ethical protein shake, such that reading more and more diversely will somehow build the muscles in us that will help us see other people as human, makes a kind of superficial sense and produces a superficial effect. The problem with this type of reading is that in its practical application, usually readers end up going to writers of a demographic minority to learn things, which is to say, as a supplement for their empathy muscles, a metabolic exchange that turns writers of color into little more than ethnographers, personal trainers, to continue the metaphor. The result is that we largely end up going to writers of color to learn the specific and go to white writers to feel the universal. The problem is if we need fiction to teach us empathy, we don't really have empathy because empathy is not a one-stop destination. It's an ongoing act of both world building and world dismantling, which requires work from us in our daily lives for our daily lives, not just when we're confronted with a visibly and legibly other. Not just when a particularly gifted author has managed to make a community story come alive for the reader who's come for a quick zoo visit, always remaining on her side of the cage. But while I'm skeptical about the self-serving platitudes of empathy in fiction, there's another facet to this empathy argument that gives me pause. Because sometimes I hear people disdaining the value of empathy in art as part of what's often called political correctness in our cultural discourse, that this idea of creating empathy in art, and as a result being consciously and overtly social political, both in one's art making and one's art consumption, is one that diminishes and cheapens our relationship to art. So this argument protests against the relationship between fiction and empathy, not because of the unequal distribution of burden it places on minoritized writers versus white writers, which is a valid argument, but because prioritizing empathy in fiction gets in the way of a reader's supposedly pure relationship to that author's art, its apparently sacred, non-political storytelling force. I'm reminded of the controversial awarding of the Nobel Prize to casually fascist stylist Peter Handke, the Austrian writer both known for his spare epigrammatic texts as well as his fervently pro-Serbian stance with regards to the collapse of the former Yugoslavia and his denial of the genocide of Bosnian Muslims at the hands of Serbian forces. Addressing the journalist attending the event, who'd asked Handke about his history of genocide denial, Handke sneered, "My people are readers, not you." Only someone who believes that readers must necessarily practice the kind of resolutely non-political critical thinking that would absolve him from deeper scrutiny would make this kind of pointed distinction. Like, our journalists, not readers. It's a tellingly autocratic vision of the relationship between an author and a readership, that we as readers are an author's people, and that to be someone's people means to turn a blind eye to the fullness of their personhood, their work, their beliefs, their lives. What Handke really seems to mean are fans, enablers, sycophants. For that's all the depth of readership that this level of sensitivity to critique can withstand. By being his reader, does that mean we're his people? Is that what it means? Is that all it means to be a reader? I am the last person who would ask us to read less, to remove authors, even ones like Handke, from our shelves. But we have to push back against the idea that engaging with our art in ways that look beyond the aesthetic is a cheapening of that engagement. Not least of all because the people who are so eager to police the borders of our critical engagement are reading politically. It's a political choice to protect certain writers while willfully ignoring choice parts of their oeuvre, reading Handke's books the non-political way. It's a political choice to declare that not reading writers like Handke or protesting the Nobel's legitimizing of his work is tantamount to a foreclosure of readerly curiosity, and not think, for example, that it might be equally incurious of a reader to vociferously defend the right to read supposedly non-political white European men and not seek out the chance to make space on one's shelf for the apparently inherently politicized everyone else. It's a political choice to say that certain artists make real art that must be protected, and other artists, seemingly always writers of color, queer writers, minoritized writers, make only socialist realism and dogma. In the end, we can't say we believe in things like diversity in fiction or decolonizing our art if we don't think something of value, something which is not solely aesthetic and which bears something beyond the overt political value of a vote, occurs when we encounter a work of art. Either we think that art can affect some extra political and extra aesthetic change in the world, how we live in it, how we see ourselves and each other, or we don't. In which case, let's just stop lying when we say that we want more complex books about women or more variegated stories about immigrant communities or better trans narratives. Unless, however, it's only that we believe in art and empathy building when we don't have to call it empathy building, when it's just the inherited status quo that comes with a 24-hour cycle of saturation in white-centered narrative, white-centered imaginative, intellectual, and moral narrative life, the genre I still jokingly call white people having feelings. The knee-jerk empathy that white supremacy levies from us every day and which gets to go unnamed. Because it is empathy building to defend Hanke's narrative universe from closer scrutiny. It is empathy building to ask us to look at his characters universally and not specifically, in the benevolent macro and not the more sharply defined micro. But writers like Hanke don't think of their readers as deliberately practicing a very specific kind of empathy building that protects these very specific kinds of writers. To them, this is what readership, as they've always known it, as it has always been peopled, is supposed to do. Thanks.
Thank you for reading from that, and I hope that attendees have questions about it. And we do go to Q&A. I'm wondering, like, what led you to write this piece? We know you as a fiction writer, obviously. So I'm curious about, you've also written criticism, but I feel like the public knows you primarily as a fiction writer. So I wonder what's led you to write these essays about, our public reading culture, rather than examples of our reading culture play out in the chat. But and I'm also curious, this is part two of this question, about how you think the political plays out in America Is Not the Heart, because I think, people might read the book and assume that as it is a beautiful, generation spanning story of this Filipino family, just unbelievably gorgeous. But it's also a very deeply politically engaged novel. And I guess I wonder how you see it as being politically engaged and how you think of like literature and politics colliding.
Yeah. The first answer to your question is probably how did I start writing? Because I think I started writing this as a result of touring America's Not the Heart. I mean, I think I'd been working on essays for a while, but I actually wrote most of what has become the collection in a kind of very intense fugue state. Apparently I have these, we were just talking about fugue states. When I was in Sydney and New Zealand, when I was in Australia and New Zealand for the writers' festivals out there. So there was like a 3-week period where I was first in Sydney, and then I was in Auckland, and a little bit of sort of tourism in New Zealand in between. And I think, I mean, maybe it was just one of those like that compressed intensity of you're traveling, you're jet lagged, all of your ideas are at their like most intense knife edge, and you are encountering readerly culture kind of in a daily way. And while so many of those events, I have to say, were really affirming, and I was able to meet so many incredible readers and other writers, and had discussions about the book that really I think I will treasure always. I think it really also confirmed for me that there was just something wrong with our reading culture and how we approach the books of writers of color. I mean, for example, like I think I was just reflecting on how many panels that I'd been on that was all sort of either a kind of very obvious sort of diversity panel, a kind of very obvious sort of like we've hired too many white people. I'm not talking about the Sydney and New Zealand festivals. I'm talking about sort of the entirety of the 2 years I was on tour, basically. But the kind of basically, I think I realized that I'd never been on a panel that was just like women, women. I think I had just gone to a panel where it was like 21st century women writing or something. Every woman that was there was white. And I was like, cool. Because, I don't have anything to say about women, I only have stuff to say about sort of war, immigration, being a minority and how terrible that is, and things that essentially, I guess, make white people cry. It was that type of dynamic that felt sort of resurgent. And I think, especially if you, at the most basic sense, if you're a writer, if you become a writer, there's something in you that loves books, right? That loves reading, that had at some point some formative, crystalline love and feeling of being saved by books that I just didn't. I never read books sort of like, well, let me learn about Filipino tragedy, or I really want to read about the Marcos regime. I went to books to practice the kind of vulnerability and intimacy that can be practiced in that specific art form, with a reader's relationship to a book. But time and time again, I just saw that the relationship that readers, and I mean a majority white readership had to the books of writers of color, was not one of vulnerability or mutual intimacy. It was one of ethnography. It was one of teach me things. It was one of show me the things that a Google search would be too boring for, or show me this story, but I want the glossary for it, or I want the map for it. And like the joke that I would always say is like, when I read books by white middle class authors from Brooklyn, I don't know anything about Brooklyn, but no one gives glossaries to me. I didn't know what a flat white is for a really long time. I mean, I'm sure there is a racial joke about flat white there, but I think that was the impetus for starting to write about it. I think in the kind of most basic sense, I was like, I don't actually think I can write a novel or put another novel into this literary culture if I don't actually just say something about how I feel about the literary culture that I apparently have now work in. I think that was really it. And second, literature and politics, and America's Not the Heart and politics. I mean, I think, I'm definitely one of those cats that thinks, all art is political, especially the art that doesn't consider itself political, like Hanke or his supporters. Especially the art that's like, I'm just writing about women. I'm like, you're writing very specifically about white middle class women in England, but okay. The hating is starting now. I'm just kidding. So very much, I think for me, I think there's obviously in the novel, in a novel that is about, someone who was part of a communist insurgency and then becomes an undocumented queer woman in California, in the Bay Area. There are kind of built-in politics that adhere to someone with those biographical details. So of course there is, there's an element there's, I wanted to write about a bi woman. I'm a bi woman. I wanted to see, bi women of color in fiction, and particularly bi Filipinx women. And, I wanted to write about, the communist insurgency. I wanted to write about collective action and write about collective action in a way that was not demonized, now talking about Marxist analysis. But I think also, I think for me, I also felt very aware that there were parts of the book that could be very easily absorbed as political, which is say the parts about war, or the parts about, Marcos, or the parts about, the regime, or even the parts about structural poverty in the Philippines. And I was also, and I think those are the things that are often sort of described as political in the kind of masculinist tradition of thinking what constitutes a political novel, which is to say like war, politics, government leaders, these. And I also thought, well, it's also political to talk about, what are the kinds of things that, queer women in the 90s in that Bay Area community were reading, were, the manga that they were reading, the kind of media that they were sort of seeing themselves in, how does a woman who who has experienced the kind of trauma that Hero has, how does she also learn to take care of a kid, like learn to take care of someone other than herself, the kind of politics of loving or the politics of tenderness that are also wrapped up in the book were also, I think, as important to me as, getting the history right or the geography right or the war right, although that was also very important.
Yeah, when I first read your novel, I was just reminded that, and after I read this essay, the draft that you're working on, I was reminded that art is like not politics, right? Obviously, art is not social critique, and if you think art is politics, then you're probably doing politics badly, and also doing your art pretty badly.
Shots fired.
But at who? At nobody, no. But also, like, art is not apolitical.
Yeah.
At all, right? Like, it matters whom you're writing about, like what languages are deployed, like who you choose to train, your novelist gaze upon. But I have this feeling that, and I learned this in part by reading America is at the Heart, that like what fiction can do is kind of get us beyond some of the like more rote and automatic thinking about politics that we exercise today, simply by like spelling out the details of like lived experience and like the texture of people's lives. And I say all that to ask you about food. I know you love talking about food. Elena has expressed to me in the past that she kind of like has a certain level of frustration with questions from people. But I do think that like something about the way you write food in America's at the Heart is really important. Like not as a bit of like cultural seasoning to intrigue non-Filipinx writers, but because it says something very specific about the specific communities you're writing about. So can you just like say a bit before we get to Q&A about food and community and like the political in America's at the Heart?
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, I think especially what you said at the beginning about the kind of the way fiction brings us into intimacy via these kinds of the textural details. I think I think that when I was on tour, I think the thing that I just kept banging on about, probably too much to everyone's annoyance, was like banality. I felt like that was like my moral center of the book and moral center of myself, which probably explains a lot. But banality, I mean, that focus on banality, that focus on the texture of the everyday and of the kind of on dailiness, especially writing about someone who was recovering from the kind of trauma that Hero was recovering from, that focus on the small and the ordinary and the ritualistic, the repetitive, what it takes to get through days. What does, I mean, I think it's all well and good to talk about sort of trauma and survival, but what does actually survival look like, feel like on a day-to-day basis? What are its rhythms? What are its highs and its lows? And what does it taste like? I think, and that also brings me to food. I mean, I will admit, I don't think I realized that I wrote about food as much as I did until I started getting asked about it. I don't think, and then later I asked some Filipino people, I was like, do I talk about food a lot in the book? And they're like, it's pretty normal for the level at which we talk about food. So I was like, okay, maybe this is maybe it's just a cultural thing. But I mean, I do recognize that I did end up talking about food. And I did want to write about food consciously and politically, to write about I think in the vein of that banality, that I wanted to write about the kind of everyday kitchen of a working class Filipinx family, which was, you know, not the kind of, which included stuff like canned food, you know, the kind of canned meats and sort of canned Vienna sausages and canned Spam that all of us ate, that are vestiges of the, you know, American colonial period, when, you know, American soldiers in the Philippines as a colony would essentially obviously not eat native food, because my God, how could you? And we're eating canned food, and that sort of vestige has remained with us and has become, you know, central to a lot of Filipino American. I mean, I still eat sardines like 3 times a week, and that is definitely part of that upbringing. So I think I wanted to write about food just in the same way that, you know, you wanted to write about sex or dailiness or you know, how the body is, you know, you're when you're writing about that kind of textural dailiness, you are writing about, you know, the material fact of people's lives, their bodies, how they literally survive from day to day. But then I think also I was conscious that there is a way of writing about food in immigrant novels and POC novels that can verge on the fetishistic and also that can be both in the way it's written and in the way that it's read or accepted by readers, that it can be that there's a very fetishistic way of writing about food. I mean, in the kind of cliche, like, oh, food is the first like entry gateway into a culture. It's like the easiest gateway into a culture, which, yeah, it is. But, you know, easiest gateway is potentially not always the one that you want. So I think I was wary of writing about food in that romantic way, which is, I think, why I also focused on the canned food. I wanted to write about, you know, the kind of the greasy sort of gross bits but which were also still delicious. I mean, I will caper canned Vienna sausage to this day. But, you know, I think I wanted to write about the less romantic but no less delicious, if that makes sense, politics of food.
You just made me think, like I don't necessarily pay attention to food that often when I'm reading. It's like a very forceful presence in your book, so it didn't come up. But I wonder if like it is a case that POC writers think more, or some POC writers might think more about food than others. Like I can't imagine like Jonathan Franzen writing about food. Like what?
But, you know, sometimes I do read people's books and I'm like, okay, but when do they eat? Like, I'm worried about them. And now I realize I definitely think this does come from like inherited scarcity trauma. I mean, if you grow up and in your house, your mom is really at all times like, are you hungry? Do you have food? Is there a blank, if there's a blank space in your cupboard, that is going to traumatize me. So you need to, here's like 3,000 cans of sardines or whatever, which is my everyday with my mom. So it might just come from that.
You sound lucky, I have to say. With that, I think we should get to Q&A. So I assume we'll be seeing people's questions, and I've been seeing quite a bit of questions in the chat already.
Hi, I can jump in and read the questions if you'd like.
Sure, yeah.
And this is Anissa, the voice from behind. There are lots of comments, great comments, and lots of.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm hands-free. That's why I'm not responding to things. I will try to look at the chat afterwards, but that's why I'm not seeing messages. But hello, everyone.
Everyone thanks you for bringing. I'll just read this one comment that's powerful. Thank you for bringing your insight. It's funny because I've always felt annoyed that stories from minorities and writers of color are so often about tragedy and what makes us different. And I always wanted to read more writing that felt universal and didn't feel like it was a translation written for white people, but was something written about me for me. I thought of it as frustration I had towards our writers and didn't make the connections that it was what is a demand is for, what demand is for. So there's lots of great comments, but I'm gonna go straight to the questions. Elaine, I love your work and your way of thinking forever. Can you talk about the role of emotion and making new work, and the role of emotion in maneuvering the racist distortions of the literary world? Thank you for all you do.
Oh, thank you. That's a very, very kind comment. The role of emotion in making new work. I mean, it's paramount. I think, well, I'm gonna say it's paramount, which is a lot for me to say, given that I am, I think, lovingly known in my family as a hard ass with no feelings. So I think probably in the practice of writing is when I'm probably most emotional, or if anything, it's the space where I actually have to have them, or have to not do the repressing that I do, 23 hours of the day to get through. So I think very, very much so the emotion of writing something new. I mean, in this hellscape, the idea of that you're writing at all, working at all, like the emotion of that at this point is only pure joy. You're like, oh, I'm actually producing ideas. I mean, I think anyone should pat themselves on the back for that. And I will pat myself on the back. Well, actually, I won't pat myself on the back because a lot of these essays were written in 2019. So I have to rewind that. But yeah, I think I think as I write more, I'm realizing, or I think I'm learning to be more vulnerable, and I think be more, dare more in terms of intimacy and in terms of the kind of emotional honesty that I mean, even if I think back on America is not the heart, and I do have enormous love and feel very proud still of that book. But I also recognize the moments in this where I can pinpoint where I was not able to be emotionally honest, where I was not that writer yet. And I think in the stuff that I'm writing now, I'm trying to be that writer. And I think that's an interesting thing to think. It's, I have compassion for the writer who was not able to go further in certain subjects that I'm aware of in that book. And I have compassion for, what it means to be a writer on that particular journey. But yeah, I think that is something that I'm working through now, is that kind of emotional honesty and emotional vulnerability in my work and how I contend with that. And in terms of emotion of navigating the publishing industry or some of the difficulties of the publishing industry. I mean, Ismail and I were just talking about this. I think people don't believe me when I say that I'm a combative person. But I mean, I think we are on a mission to create more quarrels in the literary culture. I think one of the emotions or ways that I'm sort of dealing with it is just getting angrier about stuff and being quite open about stuff that sucks, stuff that's shitty. And getting into more fights, and just going back to the kind of 6-year-old self that I was, that got into lots of fights on the playground. She was right. You have to beat people. No, I'm just kidding. Don't beat people up with no violence.
Yeah, but Elaine and I we want to vouch for the power of hateration.
Hateration
As a critical mode.
Just be a hater.
Nothing wrong with it. And he says, okay, if I choose a question.
Totally.
I love this one here from Victoria. So as a queer Filipinx person who grew up loving anime and manga, I loved how much manga comes up in the book. Are there any series that inform your work now, or any series that you would love to share?
Yes. Well, actually, I mean, I think I don't know if it's on hiatus or something right now, but the manga that I really have been loving for the past few years. It's been going on for a few years. It's a manga called, I think I've talked about it before, but it's a manga called Saizuru Tori wa Habatakanai, which means essentially like songbirds don't fly. And it's by the manga artist, or the mangaka, is Yoneda Ko. And it's basically this manga. It's very much still in the kind of yaoi genre, which is the kind of essentially sort of like gay manga, but sort of directed towards usually kind of a hetero female gaze, which has its own obviously like implications and problematic, I mean that sort of umbrella word, but implications in it. But I think this one does stand out from that genre. It's a essentially kind of gay yakuza love story, but not really love story. It's about a kind of a yakuza boss and his underling, and the yakuza boss has gone through some really very incredible sort of childhood trauma, but as a result of it is someone who deflects emotion with humor and deflects, which I have no sort of relation to that mode. I don't know anything about that, but so it's obviously something that I feel very close about. But for me, it is one of the works that I have found to be most powerful about trauma, how it lasts in a life, trauma, and it's particularly childhood trauma, and it's how it radiates through an adult life, and particularly how it radiates through one's sexual life and one's erotic life, and I think the kind of daring that the manga artist goes to sort of examine what sort of essentially sexual desire and love look like after sexual trauma, in particular childhood sexual trauma, is one that I just have found just titan in its work. I don't think it's like anything else really that I've read on a subject like that, and it's beautifully drawn. So I think that's probably my favorite one at the moment. That's one I recommend.
I feel like there are like certain kinds of like cultural production that gets taken seriously, like literary fiction, and then others that don't, like anime. But I watched Spirited Away recently, and obviously incredible. But I was reminded after watching that of that movie Grave of the Fireflies.
Oh fuck yeah!
The first anime I'd ever watched as a child. I thought it was a cartoon. It's
what?
An animated movie about post-war Japan. One of the most heartbreaking things I've ever seen in my life. If you want to cry and learn about Japanese culture after World War II, definitely watch Grave of the Fireflies. But it's one of the most incredible movies I've ever seen. Yeah, we all made the mistake of watching an anime thinking it was a cartoon. I also watched Neon Genesis Evangelion as a 10-year-old. Cartoon. Let's see.
It stands up. I was rewatching it recently, and I was like, it's still good. I think it's still good.
It's all on Netflix now, so.
Yeah, no, yeah, I was marathoning it a while back, and I was like, it's still good. Oh, Katsuragi Misato, she's still like my girl. Oh, we're gonna go deep now.
This is just like an anime nostalgia talk from now on, but
yeah, you guys didn't know from 8 to 9 it's anime talk.
In addition to our critical hate group, we're gonna create.
Oh yes, right. Hateration and anime, it just rolls off the tongue.
Somebody asked in the chat to say more about hateration. Do you want to?
Do you want to take that?
I mean, Elaine and I have been theorizing this together, but I think in the spirit of her suggestion that we create more corals, we've just been observing that our critical culture these days is one in which people don't always take up like productive antagonism. So people don't really want to go in on people's work. I think that's for a variety of reasons. I think Twitter has a lot to do with that. I think that the nature of the publishing has a lot to do with that. I think scarcity thinking has a lot to do with that. But the America is at the heart comes out of a kind of quarrel that you have with and America is in the heart, which is it's a kind of like loving rejoinder to what you see as a kind of like a misguided notion in Bulosan. I think that's like perfectly fine, right? And it's not that I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it's not that you like disrespect him at all as a forebear. It's that you are kind of building upon that legacy by critiquing him, which is
and I think that really, I mean, you wrote this beautiful essay about James Baldwin on Slate, which I would recommend everybody read, about how critics misunderstand James Baldwin's influence on Black nonfiction writers. And I think you really get to that way of the kind of rush to find sort of Baldwin's heir really elides the fact that Baldwin himself as a writer was one that was very much, the idea of sort of literary ancestry was very fraught for him. And that, I think, and begs us also to think of like ancestral, the relationship to our literary forebears does not always have to be one of ancestral reverence, and that kind of productive critique is one that is necessary. It's going to keep our literary culture and conversation alive. I think that's what that's what I'm reminded of when I think about, and I think maybe this is also, I was thinking about this also, and I was just thinking, is it just the kind of Asian American cliche thing, like you're not supposed to the kind of ancestor worship cliche thing that you're not supposed to speak ill of your ancestors? And I'm here. I don't know who needs to hear this, but I'm here to tell you, you can be free. You can actually trash talk some of your ancestors. Some of them were trash. It's okay. Like it's still your grandpa. It's fine. But I think freeing us to be able to have these kinds of productive quarrels and these productive arguments to say, there's so much in Bulosan that I keep, but I think we have to make a space to talk about the misogyny that's in that book. We have to make a space to talk about whether or not the kind of pro-American optimism that, is one of the endings of the book, is that one that holds up? Is that one that holds up to, all Filipinx, people?
Yeah. And it's, we were talking last night about kind of the history of criticism in African-American literature. Just, Baldwin got his start by trashing Richard Wright. Richard Wright trashed Zora Neale Hurston all the time.
Oh yeah.
Zora got trashed by a lot of people, unfortunately. But like, Du Bois was trashing her. Du Bois was always in a feud with Booker T. Washington. The feuds were like endless on this stuff, right? But it's a kind of way of advancing thought, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's worthwhile that we trash one another.
More feuds.
We're trashing. Just one more before we go. Laurel asks, can you talk about your latest writing routine and rituals?
Latest writing routine. I scream into a pillow and then latest writing routine and rituals. I mean, to be honest right now, because that's not true, actually. I think latest writing routine is I'm mostly in an editing phase with essays, so I don't have to be in an active writing phase for the essays, but I am at the very beginning of writing a second novel, and that is pure terror, two-punch terror joy punch, and I don't have a routine for that yet. I'm not in the groove of that yet where I'm daily writing it. There were periods where I was, but I think because I'm sort of back and forth with the essays and the novel. But I mean, I think that's one writing routine that I think I'm finding myself in now, that if you are working on two things that, sometimes when one's not working, you just sort of escape to the other. And then, one of the really good days is when neither's working and you're just escaping from one to the other. And you're like, well, I guess I'll go down a YouTube K-hole and learn about, I don't know, research The Crown or whatever. But I mean, this is real. This is being real about what a writer's practice actually looks like. When I was very much in the practice of writing the essays, then yes, I was working pretty much nonstop. But I do try to have a humane writing practice, which is to say, I try to not flagellate myself, or I try not to work super, super, super late into the night. I got a dog now. I have people, I have dependents. I have to get up early, so I can't do that kind of suffering artist anymore. So at the moment, I'm in between editing and at the very beginning of working on a second novel.
Can we see Zena before we get out?
I call? She was in at the beginning when we were still in the lobby, and then at the minute the introductions started, she was like, "Peace, goodbye." She was like, I'm not. She doesn't like Zoom. I can try to call her Zena, but she knows with Zoom. She's like, listen. She's like, oh, she's coming, but she's wary. She's like, hi, mama.
All of her adoring fans might have to wait.
Dog voices. Zena, hello, mama. Hello.
You want to see? Hello, hello.
Adorable.
Sino
We
to?
didn't, talk, we didn't talk about axiomatic. I saw it on your table, but
Oh yes, it's right there. Yes. Oh, sino? Oh, oh.
maybe drink over that.
Oh yes.
I think we're out of time.
Oh well, then Dina got to be in just for the last bit.
Lucky us.
Definitely lucky us indeed. Oh my gosh. Thank you, Elaine. Thank you, Ishmael. We really appreciate your conversation tonight. And folks, I will send a follow-up with the links of all of those resources that they definitely knew they were going to talk about lots of great things. So we will include that in that doc. And our humble thank you and gracious thank you for being here tonight, authors and library community. We miss you. We love you. And that's a wrap, friends.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Senor Muhammad. Thank you. This was amazing, as always. Thank you.
Thank you, Anissa, for organizing as well.
Thank you, Anissa. Thank you guys for organizing.
Thanks,
Thank you,
friends.
everyone.